There are people walking around right now, carrying a weight they can't name. Not depression, not anxiety. Something quieter than that. Something older. Welcome to Inside the Mind. And today, we're talking about the generation that felt everything, but was never once asked how they were doing. Most people never stop to ask why they feel the way they feel. But you've always known something was different about you. Like you exist slightly outside of every conversation. Like you understand everyone around you, but nobody quite understands you back. Like you're fluent in two completely different worlds, but you're a native of neither one. And today, right now, we're going inside that. Because there is a generation of people born between 1977 and 1983 who went through something that has never happened before in human history and will never happen again. And nobody made a single documentary about them. Until now. So let's talk about Xennials, the generation nobody understood, including themselves.
Okay, so picture this. It's a Saturday morning, somewhere in the early 1980s. A kid, maybe 7, maybe 8 years old, wakes up before anyone else in the house, tiptoeing downstairs, pours cereal into a bowl, sits cross-legged on the carpet in front of the television, and waits. Because cartoons are on at a specific time, and if you miss them, they're gone. Forever. No rewind, no streaming, no watch later. You either showed up or you didn't. And that kid always showed up. That kid is probably in their late 30s or early 40s right now. Maybe sitting exactly where you're sitting. Maybe watching this on the same phone that also contains every song ever made, every film ever filmed, every piece of information ever written, all available instantly, all the time, forever. And somewhere between that Saturday morning cartoon and this exact moment, the entire world changed. And that kid changed with it.
But here's what nobody talks about. Here's what gets missed every single time someone writes about generations and identity and psychology. That change, that shift from the old world to the new one, it didn't happen to everyone equally. It didn't land the same way on a 50-year-old who already had a fully formed identity. It didn't land the same way on a 15-year-old who grew up thinking the internet was just always there, like gravity, like weather. It landed hardest, and most specifically, on the people who were young enough to absorb it completely, but old enough to remember what existed before it. It landed on Xennials. And what it did to them psychologically, what it actually did underneath the surface, in the parts of the brain that nobody can see, that's what we're getting into today.
Let me tell you about a guy. We'll call him Daniel. Born in 1979. Grew up in a small town. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Where you rode your bike to your friend's house because there was no other way to ask if they wanted to come out and play. No texting, no WhatsApp. You just showed up at the door, knocked, and waited to see if they were home. Daniel remembers summer holidays that lasted forever. Weeks that felt like months. Long, slow, stretching days where boredom wasn't a problem to be solved. It was just the weather. And in that boredom, something happened. He built things. He imagined things. He and his friends created entire worlds out of nothing. Sticks and mud and bicycle wheels and pure, uninterrupted imagination. And then Daniel turned 16, and a computer arrived in his house. Not a sleek laptop, an enormous beige box that sat on a desk and hummed like it was thinking very hard about something. And Daniel, like every Xennial, sat down in front of it and figured it out. Not because someone taught him, not because there was a tutorial, just because that's what Xennials did. They sat in front of new things and figured them out through sheer stubbornness and curiosity.
And by the time Daniel was 20, he had an email address. By 23, he was on early social media. By 25, he had his first smartphone. And now he's in his mid-40s, completely fluent in every piece of technology the modern world has thrown at him. But Daniel told me something once that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, "I always feel like I'm performing comfort with technology. Like I know how to use all of it, but I never fully trust it the way younger people do. Because I remember what it felt like before it existed, and that memory never goes away." That's not a complaint. That's not nostalgia in the weak, sentimental sense. That is a psychological imprint, a permanent orientation toward the world that was shaped by living through the single most dramatic technological transition in human history, at the exact age when identity is still being formed. That is what makes Xennials genuinely, scientifically, psychologically different.
Here's something the researchers actually found, and this part is important. Dr. Dan McAdams at Northwestern University has spent decades studying how people construct their personal narratives, how the stories we tell about ourselves shape who we actually become. And one of his core findings is this: the experiences we have during what he calls the identity-forming years, roughly ages 12 to 25, become the foundation of our entire psychological architecture. Everything after that gets filtered through what happened in those years. The values we form, the fears we carry, the things that feel safe and the things that feel threatening, the way we relate to change, to loss, to new experiences, all of it rooted in that window. Now, think about what was happening in that window for someone born in 1979, or 1981, or 1977. At 12, the world is entirely analog, physical, slow. Communities are local. Information is scarce. Privacy is structural, not a setting you have to turn on, just a fact of life. Your diary has a lock on it. Your phone call happens in the kitchen where your mom might hear it. Your social circle is literally the people you can physically reach.
At 22, everything has changed. The internet exists, email exists, mobile phones exist. The world has become global overnight. Information is everywhere. Privacy is evaporating. Your social circle now theoretically includes the entire planet. That shift, that seismic, complete, total shift, happened inside the identity-forming years. Which means it didn't just change the world around Xennials. It changed the psychological structure of Xennials themselves. It became part of who they are at the deepest level. And what that produced is something genuinely rare in human psychology. It produced people who are simultaneously nostalgic and adaptive. People who can grieve what was lost and embrace what arrived at the exact same time. People who don't panic when things change, because they've already survived the biggest change there's ever been. People who understand instinctively that technology is a tool, not a replacement for human connection. Because they had human connection before the tools existed, and they know the difference.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because that psychological profile, that specific combination of adaptability and groundedness, of technological fluency and analog memory, it doesn't just affect how Xennials feel inside. It affects how they function. In work, in relationships, in the way they parent, in the way they lead. Think about the workplace for a second. There's been enormous research in the last decade about what makes teams effective, what makes organizations resilient, what makes leadership actually work in a world that's changing faster than ever. And one of the consistent findings across industries, across cultures, across different kinds of organizations is that the most effective leaders are the ones who can hold complexity, who can sit with contradictory information and not need to collapse it into a simple answer, who can understand both the old way and the new way, and make a judgment about which one the situation actually calls for.
Sound familiar?
Xennials are disproportionately represented in exactly those roles. The ones who bridge departments, the ones who translate between the senior leadership who built their careers in the pre-digital era and the younger teams who have never known anything else. The ones who get called into the room when nobody can figure out why the two sides aren't communicating. Because they speak both languages. They always have.
But I want to be honest with you now, because this isn't just a celebration. This isn't just Xennials are amazing and misunderstood and secretly the best generation. That would be too easy. And Inside the Mind doesn't do easy. There's a cost to being the bridge generation. There's a psychological weight to always being the one who understands everyone, but isn't quite fully understood by anyone. Think about identity for a moment. Not in the abstract, in the specific, personal, visceral sense. The sense of knowing who you are and where you belong and what your people look like. Gen X has an identity. Flannel shirts and cynicism, and we don't trust institutions. There are films about that identity. There are soundtracks. There are cultural artifacts that Gen X people can point to and say, that's us. That's ours. Millennials have an identity. Maybe it's been made fun of more than celebrated, but it exists. It's cohesive. It's recognizable. There are whole industries built around it.
Xennials have what exactly? A Wikipedia page that's 3 paragraphs long? A term that most people still haven't heard of? A demographic bracket that gets lumped in with one side or the other depending on whoever is doing the lumping. And that ambiguity, that lack of cultural mirror, does something to a person. Over time, quietly. It creates a low-level chronic sense of in-betweenness, not quite belonging here, not quite belonging there, being fluent in multiple worlds, but native to none of them. And when you spend enough years feeling that way, even if you can't name it, even if you'd never describe it in those terms, it starts to show up in specific patterns. Patterns like an unusual degree of self-reliance, because you learned early that the categories didn't quite fit you, so you stopped waiting for the category to validate you and started building your own framework.
Patterns like a particular kind of empathy, the ability to genuinely understand people who are very different from you, because you've spent your whole life translating between worlds, and that translation requires you to actually inhabit another perspective, not just observe it from the outside. Patterns like a complicated relationship with nostalgia, because you miss something real, something that actually existed and genuinely mattered and is genuinely gone. And sometimes that grief comes up in unexpected places, in a particular song or a smell or the specific quality of light on a late afternoon in August. And it's bigger than it should be, bigger than you can fully explain, because it's not just missing a thing, it's missing an entire way of being in the world.
There's a concept in psychology called disenfranchised grief. It was developed by Dr. Kenneth Doka, and it describes grief that isn't recognized or validated by the culture around you. Grief for a loss that others don't acknowledge as a real loss. Xennials experience a form of this. Every time someone younger rolls their eyes at nostalgia for a pre-internet world, every time someone older dismisses the genuine difficulty of navigating constant digital connectivity, every time the conversation moves past your experience without quite landing on it, you lose something small, a little piece of being seen. And the cumulative effect of that, of years and years of your specific experience not being named, not being recognized, not being studied or celebrated or even properly acknowledged, is a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being isolated. You're not isolated. You're surrounded by people. You're probably very good with people. You've had to be. But the loneliness of feeling like the full version of you, the version that holds both worlds, that carries both memories, that understands both the silence and the noise, that version has never quite been seen. Until maybe right now.
Here's something I want you to think about. Something that I think is genuinely important. You know, boredom. Real boredom. The kind that stretches out in front of you with no obvious end and no digital escape hatch. The kind that, as a child, you'd complain about. I'm bored, there's nothing to do. And your parents would say, go outside. And somehow you always found something. You always found something. Dr. Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire, she spent years specifically studying what boredom actually does to the brain. And what she found might surprise you. Boredom isn't empty. It's generative. When the brain isn't being constantly fed stimulation from outside, it turns inward. It starts producing, daydreaming, problem solving, making connections between things that don't obviously connect, generating ideas that couldn't come from anywhere else because they came from inside.
You spent years in that state. Long summers, slow weekends, car journeys with nothing but a window and your own thoughts. And something was built in those years, something in the neural architecture of how you process the world that is genuinely difficult to replicate once the constant stimulation begins. You built an inner life, a rich, complex, self-sustaining inner life that doesn't need external input to function, that can sit with silence and not panic, that can be alone without being lonely in that deep, destabilizing way. And here's the uncomfortable truth that comes with that. You now live in a world that is actively hostile to that inner life. A world that is designed deliberately by very smart people with very specific commercial interests to prevent you from ever experiencing the boredom that built you. Notifications, autoplay, infinite scroll, every single feature of every single platform you use is engineered to occupy exactly the mental space where your most important thinking used to happen. And you feel that tension, don't you? That pull between the deep part of you that needs quiet and the world that never stops being loud. That sense that something important is being crowded out, but you can't quite get to it because there's always another notification, always another thing to respond to, always another reason to stay connected. That tension is not weakness. That tension is not a failure of willpower. That tension is the sound of your analog soul living inside a digital world. And it's completely, entirely, scientifically valid.
Let me tell you about Sarah. Born 1981. 2 kids, works in communications, which is ironic, she says, because she spends half her working life helping organizations communicate digitally, and the other half secretly fantasizing about a world where her phone doesn't exist. She told me something that I think a lot of Xennials are going to recognize. She said, when my kids are bored, their first instinct is to reach for a screen. And I get it. I'm not judging them. It's the world they grew up in. But I remember that boredom differently. I remember it as the beginning of something. Like, you'd be bored for 20 minutes, and then suddenly you'd be building a whole world in the back garden with your friends, writing a story, teaching yourself something nobody taught you.
The boredom was the starting gun. And I miss that. I genuinely miss that. And I feel guilty missing it, because it sounds like I'm just saying things were better back then, which I know is annoying. But it's not that things were better. It's that something specific was present that isn't present anymore, and I can feel its absence. That's not a 42-year-old woman being sentimental. That is a 42-year-old woman accurately describing a measurable psychological and neurological phenomenon. She can feel the absence of something real because she knew what its presence felt like. And most people around her, younger and older, don't have that precise reference point. That's the Xennial experience in one paragraph.
So,
Where does that leave you? After all of this, after the psychology and the research and the stories and the grief and the strange specific beauty of what your generation actually is, where does it leave you? Here's what I think, and I want to say this carefully because I mean it completely. You are not a failed Gen X. You are not an early millennial. You are not a demographic error or a rounding mistake, or a generation that fell through the cracks. You are the hinge of history. You are the human beings who stood at the exact pivot point of the most dramatic transition our species has ever made, from one way of being in the world to a completely different way of being in the world. And you didn't break. You didn't retreat into the past and refuse to engage with the future. You didn't abandon the past and pretend the future was always inevitable. You held both. You hold both. Right now, in this exact moment, you are holding both. And the world, whether it knows it or not, needs that more than it has ever needed it.
Because the generation that grew up before the algorithm knows something the algorithm can never teach. They know what it feels like to be bored and survive it, to be unreachable and be okay, to wait for something without being able to check how long the wait will be, to make a phone call and not know if anyone will answer, to show up somewhere and not be sure what you'll find. They know that uncertainty isn't the enemy, that silence isn't the enemy, that being disconnected for an afternoon doesn't mean you're missing anything that matters. They know in their bones, in the deep, wordless way that you only know things you've actually lived, that the most important things in a human life cannot be streamed, cannot be scrolled to, cannot be delivered to your door in 2 days with free shipping. They have to be built, slowly, out of boredom and friction and presence and time. And Xennials know how to build them because they did it once already, before any of the tools existed.
So, the next time you feel that in-betweenness, that quiet sense of not quite fitting the category, not quite belonging to the conversation, being too old for this and too young for that, I want you to remember something. The people who stood at the edge of the old world and the new world and understood both of them, those are not the forgotten people. Those are the witnesses, the translators, the ones who carry the memory of what was and the fluency for what is, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's you. That has always been you. And it was about time somebody said it.
If this felt like the conversation you've been waiting to have, if something in this landed in a place that doesn't usually get touched, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because I promise you, there are people in your life who have been feeling exactly this and have never had words for it. And if you want more of this, more of the real psychology, the real stories, the real conversations about why we are the way we are, then come inside. Subscribe to Inside the Mind, because we go deep here. We go honest here. And we're just getting started.